We are going to look at 4 particular well-known theories of motivation. And then we're going to look at them critically in a cross-cultural context. So even if you have studied motivation theories before, you probably won't have looked at them in this context before. So motivation is a very popular topic. I expect that some of you will have chosen motivation to deal with in your assessment. It's an obvious one, really. What is a manager supposed to do, apart from check that the processes are running smoothly? A manager is supposed to get the best out of their employees, and that is what motivation is all about. So really, motivation is right at the heart of what a manager does. And it's important to think about this critically and think of your own perspective on this. So we're going to look at 4 motivation theories. Each one of these is culturally variable. And we're going to look at how individual differences come into this. There's motivation, there's culture, and then there's individuals. This makes it quite a complex topic to look at. And then we're going to look at, just very briefly, just talk about what human resources management does, because that, again, is part of your assignment. So, motivating people is about getting the best out of them. So if you have a resource, you need to get the most out of it, whatever it is. So if you have a building, you don't want half of it empty, you want to use it. If you've borrowed some money from the bank, you want to make sure that it's used effectively to improve the performance of the business. Similarly, you have a human resource, that is your employees, and you need to get the best out of them. If they're not motivated, they won't do their best work, and the organization will not perform as well as it could. So having an ability to get the best out of employees is an important talent for a manager, an important one to develop. In order to do that, you have to understand people and what motivates them. So motivation actually kind of stands on the dividing line between business and psychology. And there's quite a lot of psychology in what we're going to be talking about. So motivation is linked to staff turnover. There's my, staff turnover. If people are not happy, they're going to leave, and that is an expense for the business. If you have to recruit people, it's expensive, however you do it. And actually training people up, even if they're experienced in that field, to the way that you do it, takes time, and it's an expense. Job satisfaction. People perform better if they are satisfied with what they're doing. And this actually links to another, something else that's a little bit beyond our scope this afternoon perhaps, but something called organizational citizenship behavior, meaning when people do things that they don't have to do, that isn't really part of their job, but they can see that it's advantageous for the organization for them to do it, and they don't expect any particular reward for it. That, of course, is a very good thing to have in an organization, because that it will improve performance. So in the end, motivation has an effect on performance and effectiveness. Performance, by the way, these are technical terms in a way, and as you know, you're learning lots of technical terms in this module. Performance means things that you can measure, usually to do with financial aspects of the business. But it would be, number of units that you make, that kind of thing. Whereas effectiveness actually includes things like job satisfaction, which are intangible, but actually make a huge difference to the performance of the business. Now, if you think about what you've learnt in accounts, for example, you have learnt about performance. That is, things you can measure by looking at the figures. It's very difficult to actually quantify effectiveness, although there are ways that people have tried to measure it. But this soft side of things, this intangible side of things, is very, very significant to the performance of a business. If a business has a good culture, has motivated employees, has high job satisfaction, it is much more likely to be able to withstand unexpected events like a downturn in the market. So these things are really very crucial. So the theories that we're going to look at are these. They divide into two types. There's the content type, what they call the content type, which is a type of theory that looks at what employees need. And then there's the process type, which assumes that individual employees make rational choices about the options open to them. So I'm going to go into some detail on each of these. The content type theories were the first ones to emerge in the mid-20th century. And everybody, I think, probably everybody in the room has heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Am I right in thinking that? This is the best known theory in the field of business, bar none. Everybody who knows anything about business knows about Maslow. So if you don't, you need to brush up on it. But actually, Maslow's theory, hierarchy of needs, is rather faulty in a number of ways, and we'll discuss that in a moment. And actually, although lots of people know it and associate it with a pyramid diagram, really, in the end, not many people understand it very well. So one of my aims for this afternoon is that you will understand Maslow's hierarchy of needs and be able to critique it. Then we've got Hertzberg's two-factor theory, which is actually based on Maslow, so a kind of improvement of Maslow's theory, and that has been extremely influential. And then there's the process theories, Adams' equity theory, and Vroom's expectancy theory, and I won't make any secret of it. My favorite of these is Vroom's expectancy theory, but I'll explain why as we go along. Okay, so I don't know why it's chopping off the top of this. That heading should be why be concerned about employee motivation. Generally, highly motivated employees lead to an organization's success. That is fairly obvious, isn't it? It's common sense. So you have organizations that are very, very focused on making employees happy. And one of these is the Ritz-Carlton group of hotels, where they see themselves as being very, very service-orientated. So the way that they see it is if you look after your employees will look after your customers. If you treat your employees with respect, then your employees will treat the customers with respect. So their philosophy is very strongly that, as they put it, we are ladies and gentlemen who serve ladies and gentlemen. In other words, they like to emphasize the respect they have for their employees. And that has actually paid off for them in a big way. They're, of course, well-known luxury hotel brand. But this, strangely enough, is not a hard and fast rule. I mean, I'm not going to tell you that it is. It isn't. For example, the Cadbury company, the chocolate manufacturers, I think you did a case study in a seminar when we were looking at organizational culture about Cadbury's. You may have done that anyway. Where it talked about what a wonderful place Cadbury's was to work, how the employees were highly motivated, really loved working there and so on. But you may not know that soon after that case study was written, Cadbury's were taken over by Kraft and the culture was completely changed. And that's because, although it was a really nice place to work and the employees were highly motivated, they were not that profitable. So possibly there are other factors in this that complicate things. Also, of course, Amazon, extremely successful, profitable company, It is now anyway. It wasn't always highly profitable, but it is now. Amazon are notorious for treating their employees badly. Really, really horrible stories I've heard about working conditions at Amazon. So this is not an uncomplicated story. Being able to motivate your employees and producing good profits, they're not necessarily directly and simply related. There are other things that come into it. So just be aware of that. I don't want this to be too theoretical, and I'm not going to tell you a fairy story about this. It is much more complex. Okay, let's look at the content theories then, first of all, the needs theory. This is Maslow, very famous theory. This is a pyramid, and the needs go from the bottom to the top. The theory is that once you've fulfilled one level of needs, then you move on to the next one. So first of all, you have to have something to eat and drink and some air to breathe. Otherwise, you're dead. You can't do anything. The next thing you need is to be safe. So you can't relax and actually get on with anything much if you think that a lion's going to eat you or something like that at any moment. Once you've satisfied that need, then you move on to the social needs. You want to belong to a group. You want to feel part of something. People are not a lone type of animal. People like to be in groups. People exist in groups. People identify themselves as being parts of groups mostly. Very few people want to spend a lot of time on their own. And people who are forced to spend time on their own tend to find that they go a bit crazy. And of course, one of the worst punishments that you can inflict on somebody is to lock them up in solitary confinement. So having social needs is very important. But having belonged to a group, then you want to be valued by that group. You want to be respected. You want to be seen as somebody who has something to contribute. Perhaps something to contribute more than other people, at least in some areas. So that takes you on to the esteem needs. And finally, self-actualization. This is when you are relaxing in the evening and thinking, how would I like my life to be? What would I really like to do? And that being the best you that you can be is called self-actualization. Now, this is a theory that Maslow came up with in the 1940s. He did it with very little empirical evidence. It's never really been empirically tested. Think of it as being a useful diagram. In other words, not really a theory, just a way of looking at things. That is the best way to look at it. It doesn't really predict very much. I mean, for example, talk about safety needs. You find people who are trying to play the piano extremely well who are living in a war zone. So how does safety needs and self-actualization come about at the same time in that case? And in fact, I have colleagues who grew up in war zones who spent their time studying very hard, which again is self-actualization and probably esteem needs. So it doesn't really work in terms of the way that Maslow thought of it originally, that you fulfill one need and then move on to the next one. And actually, there have been some suggestions about how to modify it, like the higher you go up in the pyramid, the less you need to fulfill that need before you can move on to the next one. So there has been, for example, a suggestion that if you fulfill 40% of esteem needs, then you might want to move on to self-actualization without necessarily having to fulfill them any further. However, of course, it's undoubted that the physical needs are the most important ones. If you haven't got any air to breathe, you're dead in a few seconds. If you haven't got any food to eat, you're going to be dead in a few days. And if you haven't got anywhere to shelter from the wind and the rain, well, you're probably not going to have a long life either. So those physical needs are obviously extremely important. Now, I kind of think, oh dear, it's lost. It's lost the bottom bit of the slide. Anyway, never mind. I can talk about it. Oh, is that, no, it hasn't come up. I have a theory about how Maslow came up with this theory. There was a book published in 1719 called Robinson Crusoe. I don't know if you've heard of it. Who's heard of Robinson Crusoe? Yeah, you have? One or two of you? If this were 50 years ago, you would all have heard of it. You would all have read it. For a couple of hundred years, that was one of these stories that everybody knew, right up until probably about the 1970s, in fact. And Robinson Crusoe is a story about this young guy who, his parents want him to be a lawyer. He doesn't want to be anything so boring. He wants to go to sea, see the world, and make his fortune. So he goes off to sea against his parents' wishes and advice. He has some adventures, and eventually he gets shipwrecked. And he's the only survivor, and he gets washed up on this desert island, and there's nobody there. So the first thing he has to do, of course, is try and get some whatever he can from the shipwreckage. He manages to get some tools, and using those, he manages to find some food, and then he manages to find a water source, and then he builds himself a shelter, and you see where the story's going. It actually moves up the pyramid. There are some wild animals, so he builds a stockade around his hut to keep them out. Then, of course, he's on his own. Strangely enough, there's some nearby islands where there are some very primitive and unpleasant people, and they have a prisoner who escapes from them. He comes to Robinson Crusoe's island, so he's now got a friend, so his social needs start to get fulfilled. Then after a time, various things happen. I won't go into the details, but eventually he gets rescued. He goes back to England, and he makes lots of money, and he's very happy because he's self-actualized. That's what he intended to do in the first place, was to see the world and to make a lot of money, seek his fortune. So I think that story was actually in the back of Maslow's mind when he came up with this theory. And of course, it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, as a thought experiment, but perhaps in reality it wouldn't quite work out in necessarily so neat an order. Anyway, that's my theory of how Maslow came about his theory. Now, Hertzberg improves on the theory. But let's draw a line right across the middle of this pyramid, round about where the social needs are. That's what Hertzberg does. Hertzberg says there are two kinds of motivators. And he only calls the top type, the ones that are to do with the top three layers, he only calls those motivators. He calls the bottom ones hygiene. Now, the way he looks at it, and I think he's absolutely right, is that if you are trying to fulfill these lower needs, once you've got enough of them, you don't need any more. If you've got enough food, you don't need any more. You know, if somebody puts a plate of food in front of you for your dinner, you're happy. You're not going to pay twice as much to have twice as much food because the other half of it you couldn't eat. So what he says is that, oops, sorry, that shouldn't have been that. What he says is that these bottom level needs, they are fulfillable. Once you've fulfilled them, you don't need any more. Once you've got enough air to breathe, you don't need any more air. Once you've got enough water to drink, you don't need any more water. But controversially, Hertzberg said that money is a hygiene factor. He says once you've got enough money, you don't need any more money. Yeah? So if you say, I give you £1 million to come to my lecture, yeah? Are you going to be any more motivated if I give you 2 million? No. So £1 million will be enough. I might as well save the other £1 million, because you'd come anyway, wouldn't you? You can't come to the lecture more. So this is what Hertzberg says. He says that money is only a motivator up to the point where you've got enough of it. And that point at which you've got enough of it, of course, depends on the individual, because individuals have different expectations. But once they've got enough, people are not going to try any harder to get any more, he says. And if you think about that, I think that there's a lot of truth in it, isn't there? If you're doing a job that you don't like for the money, what happens after a time? You start thinking about how you could afford not to do this job that you don't like. Perhaps do something that you like more. And lots of people have career plans like that. They say, okay, I'll do this job I don't like. You know, I don't want to be an accountant, but I'll be an accountant for 10 years so I can save some money and then I can start a floristry business or whatever it was that they really wanted to do. So one of the reasons why these theories are called content theories is because the motivation at the top here comes from doing the work itself. This is the satisfaction that you get from doing the work. So let's say you are doing a very boring job in a bank and you think, wouldn't it be nice if I could just be a teacher instead? I'd feel I was doing something much more worthwhile, something much more socially acceptable. Then you might take a salary cut to do it. So that is a summary of Hertzberg's theory. Hygiene factors then. Shortfalls cause dissatisfaction, but once you've got enough of it, you don't need any more. You're not going to be motivated to get any more. And these are extrinsic to the work. These do not come from the work, doing the work in itself. But then you've got the motivating factors where people want to achieve more. They see their work as being, according to Maslow, as a way to grow personally, to become more, perhaps more of what they want to be. Now, you might actually point out that there are certain weaknesses with the content way of looking at things. One of them is, of course, that this is a theory that applies to everybody. According to the content theorists, there is no room for individual differences. But actually, the part of Hertzberg's theory that people discuss less than the two-part motivating theory, the two-factor theory, is the theory of job enrichment, which is based on it. And what Hertzberg says is that when you employ somebody, you should employ them to do more than they actually can do when they start. So when they start, they have certain skills, certain aptitudes, certain knowledge, but then you give them a job which is bigger than that requires more of them, so they can grow into it, so that they experience work as personal growth. So they grow from the blue circle here, which is what they're able to do at the beginning. You train them, you nurture them, you give them advice, and they grow so they can do the larger job. This, of course, is, again, it's a good theory. It's a little bit limited in that it isn't always possible to give people a job that they can grow into. In any organization, you've only got certain jobs that need to be done. You can't go around inventing jobs so that people can grow into them. And of course, this also only applies really to people who are doing professional jobs, doesn't it? It doesn't really apply to people who are doing menial jobs, not so well anyway. So for people who have professional careers, like accountants and scientists and so on, this isn't a bad model if you can do it. And perhaps you can to a large extent in large organizations. But it doesn't apply to everybody. If we can just go back to Maslow again, Maslow's pyramid, and point out that one of the points about this is this self-actualization will mean very, very different things to different people. I mean, to one person it might be playing the guitar. To another person it might be religious observance. To somebody else, it might be that they're a serial killer and killing more people is what is their self-actualization. You know, that self-actualization is kind of ambiguous, and it's a bit rather mid-20th century American, don't you think? It's a bit hippie. It's a bit, you know, let's all go out there and do our own thing. So this is actually also has the weakness of being rather specific to its place and time of origin, I think. Now, let's just think about the thing that content theories, that says work orientation, by the way. Let's just think about the thing that the content theorists don't actually look at all, really, which is individual differences. Now, Goldthorpe did a study in the late 1960s looking at why people seem to be happy with different working conditions. He looked at some people working in a car factory. Now, these were people doing really boring work, but they were being paid a lot for it. So they had got these jobs some time ago when they had a choice of work. They'd gone for the highest paying option, and they'd stuck with it. And Goldthorpe wondered why. Why would some people do that and other people wouldn't? He did some research on this and came up with the theory that there were 3 different kinds of motivation. And these are to actually apply for a job and stick to it. Now, I think that it's oversimplistic. I think that there are more than 3, but I think it's a good way of looking at things. Really, what he's saying is that you have certain expectations of work which you learn when you're very young, before you're conscious even that there is work. But if you see your dad, for example, you're a boy, you see your dad going off every day to work in a suit and tie, carrying a briefcase, and he comes home and talks about how he's having difficulty with organizing his subordinates, then you will take for granted that you will have some kind of managerial professional job because that is what work is. If on the other hand you're a boy and your dad goes off to work every day wearing overalls and comes home quite dirty in the evening and because he's been working on a building site, say, then you will assume that that is normal work. That is what work is. It's going out and getting dirty in a pair of overalls. And according to Goldthorpe, this is something that is very, very deeply entrenched in us. So he decided that there were actually 3 work orientations. There's the bureaucratic orientation, where people are motivated by improving themselves. This actually fits in with Maslow and Hertzberg quite nicely, because people grow through their work. They get qualifications, and then they have a career path where they get promoted, and they get more money, and they get more experience, and they get more respect from their work. At the other end of the spectrum is the instrumental orientation, where people only go to work for the money. Something they have to do, they go to work for as short a time as possible, they'll earn as much as possible, but they don't really care about the work. They don't expect to. So all of their own personal stuff they do outside of work. Any personal growth that they do is outside of work. And then the third one he calls solidaristic orientation, and that's where people go to work in order to feel that they belong to something. Now, if you have a particular work orientation and you find yourself in a situation where your expectations are not being fulfilled, and they're probably these expectations are probably completely unconscious. Like, for example, I know a lady who went to Oxford. She studied hard, she got a good degree, and then she got a job as a manager. She hated it. She did not want to be in charge. She wanted to be one of the gang. She wanted to be one of the team. She hated the idea that people might not like her because she was giving them orders. So she'd obviously grown up with a solidaristic orientation towards work, and she was trying to take on a bureaucratic orientation. And I've come across people say this a number of times, that they don't want to be a manager because they want to be one of the team and they want to be liked, not hated. They're afraid that they will not be liked by their colleagues. On the other hand, if you get somebody who has a solidaristic orientation and they're thinking, oh, I'd like to earn some more money. I'll do something like, I'll be a crane driver. You know those crane drivers on building sites that sit up there in the sky all day on their own? Did you know that those people have a very high suicide rate? Because not everybody really wants to do that. Not everybody can actually stand being on their own all the time, up there in the sky. So those people who can do that have an instrumental orientation. They just do it for the money. Whereas people who don't have that and who have a solidaristic orientation probably want to come down and join in and join a team of some sort and work with people. So these ideas of work orientation are really very important, I think. This is a kind of extension of a theory by a French sociologist called Bourdieu, who takes this much further. And he sees all sorts of things about our lives, about our personalities, that we learn in early childhood. He was particularly interested in taste. Why do you think something looks good and somebody else doesn't? And he decided that this was a lot to do with your upbringing, what looked right to you as a child. So their work orientation will be part of that habitus. If you're interested in this, do follow up on Bourdieu, very interesting thinker. Now, if we move on to the process theories, there are two of them that I particularly want to look at. There's Adams' equity theory and Vroom's expectancy theory. So first of all, Adams' equity theory. Really, both of these have kind of got a rational orientation rather than an emotional one. They assume that people make calculations and make rational choices. Adams' equity theory assumes that you work out what it is worth your while to do for a certain amount of money. How much are you prepared to put yourself out? But this is also to do with how other people are treated. So, for example, you go and get a job and you feel that the amount of money you're making is not really enough to cover the bad things about the job. Perhaps there's bad working conditions, perhaps it's uncomfortable, dirty work in some way. Unless you're being paid a fair amount of money, then you're not going to think it's worth doing it. But you're certainly not going to think it's worth doing it if you find out that somebody else down the road who's doing exactly the same work is earning more. Then you're going to think that that is unfair, and you're going to react very badly to that. People react very badly when they feel they're being treated unfairly. And that is something to bear in mind, I think, when you're a manager. You have to treat people fairly, otherwise you demotivate them. So, in order to work out whether somebody is being treated fairly or not, they have what they call referent others. That is, other people who they feel are the same as them, or who they can compare themselves to in some way, and they can say, hang on a minute, this guy or lady is getting more than me, or he's getting treated better than me. That isn't fair. I don't want to do this job anymore, or I'm going to create some trouble for my employer. So Adams' equity theory, I think it's quite useful in that these are things that a manager has to bear in mind. It's a limited theory, I think. It doesn't really cover as much as the others that we've talked about, but I think it does cover an important aspect of things. Then we have Vroom's expectancy theory. I really wish it would show the whole title there. That's Vroom, V-R-O-O-M, expectancy theory. Oh, I won't fiddle about with it. So with Vroom's expectancy theory, he has this little equation here. Motivational force equals expectancy multiplied by instrumentality multiplied by valence. So what does this mean? Motivational force is the likelihood that somebody will act in a certain way. So if you want somebody to do something, you want to know what the motivational force is for them to do it. Now, there are three parts to this. Let's say I want my students to work harder. Yeah? So, first of all, there's expectancy. They have to feel, my students have to feel, that the effort that they put in leads to better performance. Why might it not? Well, supposing your standard of English was very low, you might feel that you could work much harder at cross-cultural management and not really improve your performance because of that. Or you might be very pessimistic about your own level of ability, in which case you might think, well, if I work harder, it's not really going to make any difference, so I won't bother. So that's the first part of it. You have to feel that your effort will lead to greater performance. Then, we still are only a third of the way there to motivational force, because there is a reward for this performance. And the reward in this case is, of course, better grades in your assessment. So, is the reward linked to the performance? Now, if you thought that your examiners were completely incompetent, that we'd hired a bunch of people off the street who didn't know anything about the subject to mark your work, then you might think, well, okay, I might perform better, but nobody's going to know, so what's the point? So there has to be a reward that's linked to the performance. Then the third part is that you value the reward. Do you really want these high grades, or do they matter to you or not? If they don't matter to you, if getting a high grade doesn't matter, then you're not going to be motivated. So it requires all these three things. So I've given you the example of a student like yourself, so that you can relate to it. So I'm saying work harder, you'll perform better. If you perform better, you'll get better grades, and those will be valuable to you because it will give you a sense of achievement, and your whole degree will look better because you'll have a higher degree class in the end if you do the same with all the modules, and then you've got a better chance of getting the job or the job that you want. So that is Vroom's expectancy theory. Now, the thing about Vroom's expectancy theory is that people are motivated by different things. What somebody values, for example, is not the same as what somebody else values. So this theory is, above all the other three that we've looked at, very concerned about individuals and how they see things. So let me give you an example. Supposing you're a manager, you have a team of people, one of whom is a young guy who's really into cars, and he wants to get a better car. You know, he wants something that goes a bit faster, makes a better noise, that sort of thing. And then somebody else in the team is a single parent who is struggling to bring up a child. They are not going to be motivated by the same things, are they? There's no way that they're going to be motivated by the same things. To the young guy, he wants the money to buy the car. To the single mother, she probably wants the time to spend with her child. So these are two different ways of motivating people, surely. And you have to bear that in mind. So really, if you're going to employ expectancy theory, you have to know your employees well. You have to know them as individuals. You have to be able to give them the rewards that they need in order to fulfill their needs, their particular needs, rather than assuming that you know about people's needs in a kind of blanket sort of way. Okay, so those are your 4 theories. Yeah. The extent to which they don't work in the context outside of which they were invented, of course, as it says here, if you're fatalistic, if you feel that, there's a summary of that, by the way, on that slide. If you feel, with the expectancy theory, if you feel that you can't really make a difference to things, if you feel that things just happen to you without you having any control over it, which is more the case in Chinese culture with Middle Eastern cultures, they're more fatalistic than Western cultures, then that expectancy theory isn't going to work so well. Adam's equity theory doesn't work so well in a high power distance context, because people expect there to be unfairness. They expect that some people are going to be treated better than them. So that theory doesn't work so well in that context. Hertzberg emphasizes autonomy. That is, being able to do your own thing, being able to develop your own skills, your own ambitions. That works very well in a Western context, where people are individualistic. Doesn't work so well in a collectivist context, where people are always thinking about us rather than me. And of course, with Maslow even, the interpretation of those different levels will vary from one society to another. Now, I think we're getting a bit low on time, but I'll very quickly just say something about human resource management. We don't have much time to deal with that on this module at all, but it is something that maybe some of you will go into more in other modules. Human resource management is all about getting the best out of that human resource. So an understanding of motivation is important to an understanding of human resource management. It's a kind of fundamental topic. Of course, there's a lot more to human resource management than that. It's to do with hiring and firing and the legal side of things and remuneration and so on. But all of these things fit together, and motivation is one of those factors that does actually bring them together. How do you, for example, use your remuneration structure, that is how you pay people, to motivate them? According to Maslow and Hertzberg, it isn't necessarily that important up to a point, but finding where that point is and how you actually motivate those individuals, if you're going to use Vroom, is important to work out. So this is all, everything I've said is potentially of use to you in your assignment. So I hope that you will be able to make use of this. We're going to look at some case studies in the seminars now, this afternoon, which expand on some of these themes that I've been talking about. So given that we have a way to go to the seminars, I think we'll come to an end there, and I'll see my groups in about 10 minutes. Thank you very much.